do their best to answer.
And that brings us to our morning keynote. I would like to introduce Nara and Paul presenting on NPR's 15-year journey with PHP.
Actually, I don't know. I don't think this is what we want. Damn it.
Okay.
But now we're going to have that problem again.
Okay.
I can't full screen.
Oh, okay. Well, let's just
Hold on.
run it here and go without the notes. Then.
Never mind. I got it. Yeah.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Sorry about that. Nara and I are really excited to be here to talk with you about NPR's 15-year journey with PHP. My name is Paul Miles. I'm the software development manager at NPR, and with me today, co-presenting today, is Nara, and I'll let her introduce herself and get the presentation started. Thanks.
Yeah, so my name is Nara Kaspergen. I'm a full stack developer at NPR, and for those of you who are maybe international, haven't heard of NPR before, NPR stands for National Public Radio. So we are a nonprofit public media organization. We are nationwide, but our headquarters is right here, this beautiful building in Washington, D.C. It's close to Union Station. And we work in a department called Digital Media. Digital media is a mix of product managers, project managers, designers, and developers, and a few kind of other weird interdisciplinary roles. Our development team, we do have dedicated mobile developers and web developers, and one interesting fun fact is that our web developers are not specialized. We're all full stack, so we don't differentiate between front end and back end. Everyone is expected to be able to work on all parts of the stack. And we have three primary responsibilities. The first is npr.org, the main technical infrastructure of it and the design of it. There's also our mobile apps, which are NPR One and NPR News. And then finally, there's our in-house, homegrown content management system called Seamus. And then obviously, we also manage the APIs that power all of these. So for today, we're going to be focusing mainly on npr.org, and we're going to be telling the story in 5 acts. And Paul's going to start it off with the beginning.
Right. So 15 years ago, almost to the day, is when npr.org launches. There's always been an npr.org, but it mostly consisted of static files. Cold Fusion was rumored to be a thing way back in the early days, around 1995, kind of going into the late 90s. But it became pretty obvious that NPR would need to have a first-class content management system. And so that's November 2001 is basically when that was introduced. The back end was built in Java. The content management system that editors use, built in Java. There was an Oracle database, but the front end of npr.org was then served by PHP. Decisions, no one on the team actually worked. No one currently on the team worked on that project, but what we understand it is at the time, PHP was chosen because it's better for performance at that particular time. And this is what it looked like, the homepage. State of the art 15 years ago. This is what one of the news listing pages looks like back then. Back at that particular moment in time, npr.org was more of an extension of the radio. Most people think of NPR, they think of the radio. And this website sort of plays into that. It's mostly an audio-oriented experience, and I think that the target audience at the time was more for if you wanted to listen to a story again, or if you missed one of the morning shows or something like that, you could go to npr.org and listen to it there. There's call-outs to use QuickTime and RealPlayer, all the great plugins back in the early 2000s. There was also some content build-outs. This is an example of one of those after 9/11, as one example. And the technology back then that we were working with, good old Internet Explorer 6, the world's most popular web browser. Probably still is, I don't know, I hope not. Mobile wasn't really a thing back then. This was the top selling phone in 2001. So, we didn't really have much of a mobile website or anything like that. And only 2 in 10 people got their news online anyway in 2000. Interestingly enough, 5 years or 6 years later, hasn't really changed that much, still just 3 in 10 people. Anyone got a Friendster account out there? Anyone? MySpace? I don't know. 7% of people used social media back in 2005. NPR was big in podcasting earlier on. Slate declared 2005 to be the year of the podcast. Podcasts have always been really important to NPR, and we've had them featured on our site and everything like that since around 2002, 2003. And 10% of people listened to podcasts in 2006, and we were part of that big wave at the very beginning. Technically speaking, kind of switching back to that, so this is kind of interesting. We found this out. There was no source control until 2004, and then CVS was elected as the source control system, which maybe is a little perplexing to us, but I don't know. That's apparently how things went down then. So I think that editing files live on the production server and things like that, that was sort of like the way that things were done back in the early days. So fast forwarding ahead a little bit, there's a pretty big industry announcement that happens, and that's that Apple is going to release the iPhone, and it was released in July of that year, and of course now other smartphone makers, BlackBerry and such, are coming online here, and this naturally leads into a progression where now we have our very first mobile site that was launched in November 2007, so we kind of stayed up with that announcement as well. So now's a good time to kind of usher in the smartphone era, and I'll turn it back over to Nara to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so if 2005 was the year of the podcast, then 2007 or early 2008 was kind of the year of the app. Everyone was talking about, should my organization have an app, and what does it take to build an app, and is this going to be good? How do we build an app? How are we going to monetize it? Questions like that. So obviously the NPR developers were kind of scratching their heads. We didn't have any mobile developers at the time, obviously, because that was really the first time that anyone was starting to talk about these things. And so we realized pretty quickly that there was going to be no way that we were going to be able to build a UI in-house, but then, so we were probably going to bring in a third-party contractor to build that, but that meant that we needed a way to feed them the data that we wanted them to display in the app. So that meant that we had to build an API. And so starting in late 2007, going through early 2008, we were kind of iterating on it. There were some soft launches, and then finally, in August 2008, we had our first big public release of our very first public API, which we called the Story API. And you have to remember, this is 2008. JSON still wasn't really a thing. It wasn't well supported in any of the major browsers. So it was based in XML. And they decided to use PHP again because they realized that one of the most important things for an API was going to be performance. And for us at the time, it was still a choice between PHP and Java, and PHP was going to be faster. And because they chose PHP, they also made the decision to put it in the same repository as the rest of npr.org. Our CMS, which is Java-based, it had its own repository, but they figured, oh, we're using PHP for this as well, so let's all just put all the code together in one repository. And the decision was made pretty quickly to make it public because we realized we are a public media organization, so this is probably something that we should do. And so you can see here, this is our developer center, where you can find documentation about how to use this API. And fun fact is, this is actually still online if you go to api.npr.org, and it still looks mostly the same. Although, a spoiler alert for the future, that's probably going to change in 2017 finally. But flashing back to 2008, this was actually considered state-of-the-art at the time. We were like the envy of public media organizations for having something like this. Everyone was like, wow, this is really cool, I can't believe NPR did this. And for us, besides being just like great to have a public API, it also ushered in kind of a new era of product development. Because we decided to essentially dog food our own API for what we wanted to build ourselves. And that led to us kind of being more ambitious about the products that we wanted to build and hiring on a couple new people. That got us thinking about, well, if we have a bigger team and potentially different teams working on different products at the same time, we should probably have a methodology for actually making sure that that all of those people can work together well. And so in the spring of 2009, we adopted the Scrum flavor of Agile. And kind of going along with that idea as well, they decided to introduce the idea of every developer having their own virtual machine, which was set up almost identically to our other staging and production servers, because they realized if there's going to be multiple teams working on the same code base, it's probably a good idea to not have everyone working on the exact same staging server. And also, that's when they decided to switch from CVS to SVN. Again, for many of the same reasons, they realized that if you're going to be working on the same code base, it's helpful to have things like branching and tagging, and SVN just had way better support for that. And all of that was leading up to July 2009, when the team relaunched both the CMS and NPR.org. Both were rebuilt almost from scratch, leveraging a lot of the story API under the hood. One fun fact is, at the time, there was no automation whatsoever. There was no special infrastructure for deployment. And so launching this actually took place over the span of 4 days, beginning on a Sunday. There was a whole fancy document with like steps for every day, breaking it down into like 15-minute time windows of like what every single developer was going to do to help relaunch the site and avoid downtime. We think this is also when they upgraded from PHP 4 to PHP 5, but there's only a couple people from then who are still around, and they just couldn't remember for sure. And that same month, we finally launched the Npr News App for iOS. Again, this was powered by the Story API, but a third-party contractor developed the UI. But we did kind of, manage the product development in-house, so we still considered it part of our digital media kind of portfolio of NPR apps. In October 2009, we know that they upgraded to PHP 5.2. And on the surface, this seems like a good thing. Like, we had just upgraded in July, and now we're upgrading again in October, right? Except that 5.2.0 was actually released in November of 2006. So we're still like 3 years behind the technological curve. And then November 2009 was when we finally switched from Oracle to MySQL under the hood. This had actually been pitched as being part of the big redesign in July, but then the team agreed that there were already too many moving parts, so it was too risky. And so the compromise was to essentially do that right after. Another interesting thing about this is that before this, and really dating back pretty much to 2001, everything was in one database. And at the time that made sense. They all thought, having everything centralized is a good thing. But over the course of 8 years, the site grew a ton. And so now having everything in one database was starting to be kind of an issue. So they used this as an opportunity to actually break everything up into multiple databases that kind of had different purposes and different use cases. And then finally, in November 2009, they also relaunched a new version of m.npr.org, the mobile site. And this one was also built by a third party, and that was done primarily because at the time, the approach to mobile sites was what people usually called adaptive. So you're targeting different devices and different screen sizes rather than responsive, which came later. And they realized we don't really have enough knowledge about that on our team, so they needed to bring in a contractor to build that site for them. But overall, this was a very productive period for us. The Story API, again, it helped usher in like a new phase of development for us. So from September 2007 to May 2011, there were over 8,500 commits to the master repository by 9 different developers. And as I just already previewed a little bit, starting at about like mid-2010, the conversation started to change a little bit. The whole idea of adaptive design was starting to go away. People were starting to talk more about responsive. And so that got us thinking about sort of what the next generation of NPR product should look like. And Paul's going to tell you more about that.
That's right. So, before really getting into that, though, I want to tell you a little bit about our first ever Serendipity Days. So one of our initial chief content officers at the time, chief digital officers at the time, wanted to have this idea of let's kind of like a hack week, I guess. Let's take a break from our work and spend a few days just working on some kind of project. Nothing that's directly related to our Scrum team, agile deliverables or anything like that. The first ever one of those was had in May of 2011, and the reason why I really point this out is that a responsive design, like a responsive prototype of the homepage was actually done as one of those projects. Moving ahead a little bit later, we upgrade to 5.3, so we're now closing the gap a little bit, whereas before we were like almost 3 years behind. Now we're about 2 years behind or so. So that's good, we're catching up. Another interesting thing that kind of came out of a Serendipity Day project the next year was the usage of Jenkins. So that's where some automated builds and deployments and things like that started to kind of take shape and come to life. And that was another project that was deemed, I don't know, maybe it was sort of like the best, one of the most popular projects or something, or most successful projects. We actually continued working on that, spent about a week after Serendipity Days working on that, and we ended up with some automated builds and continuous integration for the first time. Oh, I think I skipped ahead. Sorry about that. October 2012, we launched our new responsive layout. Finally, we took the blogging part of the homepage or of the website and worked on that first. For some technical reasons, that was kind of the easiest part of the code to change. Also just traffic-wise and things like that, that was a little bit of like a lower risk area for us. That's the first phase of our responsive redesign of the entire npr.org website. That's a project that actually took 2.5 years total to complete. May 2013, we begin work. This is kind of ushering in a new product line, basically. We had something called the Carbon Services come to light. So before, you've already heard about the Story API and our website, of course. We realized that we wanted to have different types of applications that were going to provide different types of experiences. We weren't really completely sure what that might look like at the time, but we knew that we wanted to do things like provide recommendations and do things like provide a centralized identity and authorization platform, that sort of thing. So we begun work on this like collection of services, and that would eventually be what powers NPR One later on. So a couple interesting things to note before I move ahead, though. We made the decision. We were going to write this in Node. That was the initial kind of thinking. But then we switched and said, OK, we're going to do this in PHP. Because we're already familiar with how to deploy PHP and deal with some of the challenges around it. So we decided to do everything in PHP. We also made one other kind of critical decision, which was deemed to be a mistake, basically, which was to add this code in with all of the other code. So now we have our website code, the Story API, and all of these new Carbon services are now still in one code base, basically. And they're still like that today. It's something that we want to change, but we haven't changed it yet. Later that July, we upgrade to PHP 5.5, and now we're finally caught up. Basically, it came out, PHP 5.5 came out in June, so now we've caught up using the latest features. And then August 2013 is when our homepage becomes responsive, one big milestone in that 2.5-year-long project. To give you an idea of the productivity of the team, then you can see it's increased even more. From in about a 2.5-year period, we have over 7,000 commits by 11 different developers on the team. So what's next? Nara's going to talk about kind of like, I don't know, the modern times, so to speak, of NPR. So.
Yeah, so starting in about December 2013, going through the summer of 2014, there was a big wave of hiring in NPR digital media, and Paul and I were both part of that wave. He was kind of at the tail end of it. I joined in March 2014, and that's actually when our first milestone for this period is as well. That's when we finally completed the switch over from SVN to Git. This was chosen because precisely they knew they were going to have a bunch of new hires coming in. New hires were much more likely to be familiar with Git than SVN. There was also much better tooling and things like IDE integration for Git. And it's kind of easier to track everyone else's commits as well, and kind of get a better sense of what everyone is working on now that the team is going to be even bigger. And going along with that as well, the same month we finally began using Composer for dependency management. We had used it for some kind of side projects that lived in other repositories before, but this was the first time when we brought it into the main code base. And again, that's because it's much more of a standard, a good use of an open source solution for a common problem. And as a bonus, new hires are much more likely to be familiar with this than some kind of custom homegrown solution. In July 2014 was our next big product milestone. That's when we finally officially launched NPR One, our newest mobile app for iOS and Android. So that was using the Carbon services that Paul talked about before. One thing that I'm personally very proud of is that we launched our iOS and Android apps at the same time. You probably know there's a lot of organizations that tend to do iOS first, and then Android comes like 6 months later. But we launched them both at the same time. And this was the first time when we did all of the development on our mobile apps in-house. You might remember that I mentioned that the Npr News App was the UI at least was mostly built by contractors. In April 2015 was a big technical milestone for us. This is when we added the first true unit test to our main repository. And I'm not saying that this is our first time using PHP unit. We actually have been using PHP unit for a very long time, probably at least 4 years. But without using Composer for dependency management, it wasn't really easy for me to track down exactly when we started using it. But the problem that we'd always had was that our tests were dependent on data being in a certain way in our databases and being returned by APIs. And having tests that depend on that meant that they were incredibly brittle, and we were wasting a lot of time every cycle going back and fixing tests and data in the database to make our tests run. So we had talked for a long time about how can we make these into true unit tests, and it was really the new people that came in that had some new ideas about how this could be done. And so finally we solved this in April 2015. By using what's called a dependency injection container. And so again, this allowed us to greatly improve our testing infrastructure and usher in much better development practices for npr.org and our APIs going forward. In June 2015 is when we began what we call our Devopsification project, and this was actually the result of a couple of our developers and sysadmins going to a DevOps conference here in DC. And the funny thing about it is they went mainly just because it was local, the tickets were not that expensive, and they were like, well, we might as well go check this out. But then they got there and they were sitting in some of these sessions and they realized, wow, the tooling has gotten so good that there's really no excuse for us not to be doing this anymore. So the minute they got back from this conference, they wrote up a proposal for our management about why we should do this, probably how long it would take, and what the benefits would be. And that was greenlit almost immediately. The whole project itself ended up taking a little over a year to complete. But what we did was we basically took a piecemeal approach where every single sprint cycle we would pick one server that we would put under chef management. And so that way, at least almost right away, we began to still be able to realize the benefits of DevOps, even if the entire system was not managed under chef yet. In March 2016 was another major product milestone for us. We finally retired our Flash-based pop-up audio player in favor of a persistent HTML5 audio player. This Flash-based pop-up player actually dates back all the way to that 2009 redesign that I talked about. And to be clear, this is a project that people had talked about doing for years. We knew this needed to go away, but there just hadn't been enough resources, in particular because of the focus on NPR One for the past couple of years. There just weren't enough developers to work on this, as well as HTML5 being deemed still a little bit unstable until recently. So finally, it took over a year in many ways because they actually needed to almost rewrite the entire site under the hood to now be almost like a single page app, because one of the biggest product goals was to make sure that if you're listening to a piece of audio and you go to a different article, you can still continue listening to that same story. In May 2016, we launched our first public developer blog at npr.codes. And this was actually my personal Serendipity Days project that I'm really proud of. And one big reason for this is we had already been used to announcing product launches on a certain section of npr.org. But we never really wrote anything that was geared specifically towards developers. And we really felt like that's something that we should start doing. So now we have a place to do that. And then finally, November 2016, and by this I mean literally a week ago, we finally upgraded to PHP 5.6. 5.6 was released in August 2014, so we had once again kind of fallen behind the technological curve. But one of the main reasons why we hadn't been able to pull it off sooner is, as I mentioned, our team had grown sharply. We're now at a scale where we have probably at least like 30 virtual machines for the different developers and designers' dev boxes, as well as all of our staging environments, our build servers, and then not to mention production. So upgrading all of those to the same version so that no one is like in a broken state because they have things that depend on 5.6 was quite a bit of an undertaking. And so it really wasn't until we got everything under chef management that this became something that we could easily do. So now it's just a matter of going into a chef recipe and like editing one line and saying, this box needs 5.6 instead of 5.5, and hitting a button that says like, propagate this change out to all machines, that we can start to do some of these things. And at the beginning, Paul talked about some of the sort of statistics of what the landscape looked like from about 2000 to 2006, so I figured I would show you kind of what we're dealing with today. Surprisingly enough, only 4 in 10 Americans still regularly get their news online in 2016. You would think that number's higher, but TV, it turns out, is actually still king. But one thing that has changed a lot is that now 65% of US adults use social media sites, and this again was up from 7% in 2005. So obviously that has a big impact on both our product development and how we try to deliver and deliver news to different people. And podcasts is up to 21% of US adults now from 11% in 2006. The interesting thing about that statistic is around 2006 it went up for a couple years and then actually declined for a while. So it didn't really start increasing again until about 2 years ago with like the serial phenomenon that some of you may have heard about. And overall, again, our team size essentially doubled. So we're now at over 17,000 commits made to our master repository by 22 different developers between December 2013 and November 2016. And now Paul's going to give you a kind of a hint of what's to come in the future.
Sure. So this is just going to be a really quick overview of what we have on store. So obviously, we're falling behind on PHP again. PHP 7's been out for almost a year, and I think I heard yesterday 7.1's coming out like next month or something. So we want to definitely upgrade to PHP 7. In particular, we're looking forward to the performance improvements that PHP 7 promises as well, and we're also looking forward to some other language features kind of coming out of PHP 7, which is going to be really great. One thing we're also looking at doing is splitting out our different components and product lines a little bit better. Right now we have everything in one large code base, and we would like to split those out and make it so we can deploy those things separately and do things that we can't currently do right now. So obviously there's a lot in store on the product side as well, product development side, but those are some of the highlights that we have kind of coming up in 2017. So we kind of reached the end of our 5-act story, but what we wanted to do is, as we were kind of preparing this content, we discovered some themes about things that have helped us do this along the way, and we wanted to take a moment to share those with you in a consolidated form. So Nora's going to start us with the first couple.
Yeah, so we've already mentioned a couple times now this thing called Serendipity Days, and how some of our both technical decisions and product decisions actually came out of projects that people did for this. So it's been really critical to our success and probably will still be going forward. And for us, the key idea is that we want to give people time and space to be creative. There's really only 2 rules for Serendipity Days. One is that you have to present what you did at the end, and the other is that whatever you work on has to be beneficial to NPR in some way. But that's left intentionally vague. There's no caveats about like you can do this, but you can't do this. We actually trust people to interpret that kind of appropriately in whatever way they think will be beneficial to NPR. And the other key idea, of course, is if someone has a good idea, actually like make some time to put that into action. Obviously, like Paul mentioned, Serendipity Days is usually only about 3 days long, so whatever they come up with, chances are it's not going to be polished, and you may need to give someone another week or 2 to actually like truly polish their idea to be in kind of an executable form. But it's worth doing. Like we've reaped the benefits from using Jenkins for builds now to again like our responsive homepage and our developer blog and other projects like that. And on kind of a similar note, like for us, Agile has worked very well. It's really a question of not fixing something that isn't broken. I still remember when I interviewed at NPR and I was talking to developers and we were talking about like product management methodologies and things like this, and everyone kept talking about how happy they were with Scrum. And I was like, what is this magical thing that's allowing developers to be productive and happy all the time? Because I came from a place that was just waterfall. But that's the truth. The developers are incredibly happy with it. They feel like it makes them more productive. They are not working more than 40 hours a week. And I think one of the big benefits too is that it's made it much more transparent within the entire organization what we're working on at any given time and what it's reasonable for us to deliver in a given sprint. But one of the key tenets of Agile is that you should always be open to changing the process if there's a need for it. And so we do take our retrospectives very seriously. Anyone in the entire department is allowed to voice if they think that something isn't working, and their feedback will very heavily be taken into account. And kind of on that note, I wanted to quickly share with you what our kind of sprint cycle calendar looks like. It's actually pretty rigid. So you can see here, we start with sprint planning on a Wednesday, and we have an official release day 2 weeks later on a Tuesday. And this is a very firm cycle. It very rarely changes, and if it does, it's usually planned out like weeks or months in advance. And one of the reasons for that is actually mostly historical. We haven't talked a lot about our CMS, but we did mention it's built in Java. It runs in Tomcat, and for those of you who know anything about Tomcat, it means that in order to deploy new code, we actually have to take the entire server down. So if you are an editor working on a story for npr.org and we tell you, oh, you have to log off for the next 10 minutes or half hour or so for us to deploy new code, that might drive you a little bit crazy. So our compromise with them has been we really only do that once every 2 weeks. We try not to do that any more frequently than that unless there's an emergency. And so that's why we have kind of a very fixed launch date planned months in advance. But we've also begun to recognize that that kind of hamstrings us from working at the speed that we would like to. And so in order to change that, Paul's going to tell you about what we're hoping to do in the area of continuous deployment.
Sure. Yeah, actually, I really don't like that we just have this one fixed release here at the end of the cycle. As our teams have grown, we now run about 6 or 7 different projects at the same time. And what we really want to do is empower every team to release the code that they've written when it's ready, rather than having everybody try to pile in and have one release once every 2 weeks. So we're moving in that direction. We actually already have moved in that direction with some of our ancillary products that we haven't really talked much about here, but we are doing a lot of things to foster, to put us in a situation where we can deploy our products more often. Okay, so separating code concerns is something that we've already taken a lot of strides to do, and we continue to do that. And as we separate those things out, we make those separately deployable units. We're not going into a direction where we're microservicing all the things or something like that. This is just more about separating out course product lines from each other. Automating everything is important. One reason why people don't deploy very often is that it's painful because it's manual or it's not a very well-defined process. Automating those things helps address all of those concerns. So it's very important. And then one thing to note is a lot of what I'm talking about involves refactoring things that are working just fine. And one thing that people always wonder is like, well, how do you deliver new features and do like these other types of infrastructure type changes at the same time? And by and large, the answer is that we do them together. We've created a culture, I guess, where developers can work with their product owners and scrum masters to get time allotted during project development to make changes that are for the betterment of the system and not just for product features as well. So there's definitely some trade-offs, and I think some developers think we'd want to do more refactoring and things like that, but we're also trying to deliver features at the same time. So DevOps has been a huge help for us. Does anyone here have like that server that Johnny set up 5 years ago, and nobody really knows how it got there? And no one wants to touch it because it's just like running, and it's like, oh, don't do that. And then like you clone it, and then like that's your testing one now, right? Like anyone got that? I see a couple heads nodding. You don't want that, obviously. So treat your infrastructure as code. You want to, can't stress that enough. And as you manage your infrastructure better, you're going to get more consistency between your environments and things like that. We used to have a problem at NPR. Maybe some of you have had this as well, where we run a test it only can run on one environment. That test won't run like on another environment because like the database isn't there, or like some other service isn't set up, or whatever the case may be. So having our DevOps effort has allowed us to really create a lot of testing environments that can really closely mirror production. And that's been really helpful, and something you kind of get as a bonus to that is it just reinforces just best testing practices, because now if you're testing something and it's broken, you're not going to just blame it on the environment anymore. It actually might be a code problem, and it allows you to change your workflow to do testing more frequently throughout your development process. Speaking of testing is a very necessary investment in any large team. So some recommendations here is run all the tests that you possibly can with every commit. You may not be able to run very long end-to-end UI tests or something like that, but run all of your unit tests and any other tests that you can, and you're going to have to put in some infrastructure around that to make that work. When we first started out with Jenkins, there was just a handful of jobs that were created that did very specific things, and now we have a whole Jenkins server with over 100 jobs that does nothing but just run tests for us. So, it's a big change that's happened over time, and it's important not just to run the tests, but also to look at the failures if that happens. And something that happens is we're dealing with a large code base, a legacy code base, which is defined as code without tests, right? Well, what kind of tests do you write then? Well, we focus on testing new features. We know that there's a lot of old code that doesn't have great test coverage, but what we're really trying to do is write code as we write new features. And something that we've done in the world of Agile is we say that our stories aren't done unless we have tests with them. So that's part of the process of definition of done for our stories. And last little bonus is if you can measure coverage, do that. And there's definitely tools out there that do that. So that leads us into the next two, which Nara will talk about.
So the sixth one is the one that I personally have been the most focused on, and I'm calling it kind of community and standards. But what I'm really talking about are things like attending conferences exactly like this one. And it's not to say that we didn't attend conferences in the past, but it used to be much more ad hoc. So either we might be offered tickets to something local, or a single developer might see something that they were interested in, but there wasn't as much of a proactive culture of let me actually look for the conferences that are useful to what I'm working on. And now that's finally changing. It's become much more of a conversation where we're all looking out for conferences that are relevant to what any one of us might be working on, and trying to send people to those. And I'm happy to say that almost every single person on our team has been to at least one conference over the past year. And of course, the next level of this is actually speaking at conferences and meetups. And this is something that really nobody at NPR Digital Media on the development team did until Paul and I got here. And we really said, we think this is important and NPR should start doing this, even though we personally didn't really have any experience in that either. But we've now gotten to the point where, for Paul, this is his 3rd conference this year, and he also spoke at 2 meetups, and for me, this is my 5th conference. And we're trying to get other people in our organization involved as well. So one of our other colleagues spoke at his first conference last month, and a different colleague who works remotely out of Chicago has spoken at a couple of meetups this year. So it's exciting to see this spreading throughout the organization, and we're continuing to try to push others to do this. And I already talked about how we launched a developer blog this past May, and we're continuing to try to come up with new content that we can post there and find things that are kind of relevant and interesting, or just things that we want to get feedback on from the community, because we feel like that's, honestly for us, like this is the best way that we can get better, is for you guys to tell us, you know, what you think we're both doing right and maybe what's things that we could do better. Using open source is, of course, a big one. And again, this is something that we had been doing, but not quite to the scale that we have been doing it recently. Back when the team was much smaller, I think there was much more of an attitude of, if we can do it ourselves, then we should, because then we'll learn more about how all of this stuff is working under the hood. And as a result, we have some incredibly smart senior developers. But now that the team is much bigger, that kind of attitude has also become a little bit unsustainable. So now what we're trying to do is, if we're trying to do something that we feel like someone else may have already done before, look for the open source solution first, and only if you can't find it, then you actually write it yourself. And then finally, paying attention to community standards and best practices. And a great example of this are, for example, the PSRs, which we haven't been great about, but we're trying to get better. We finally started using namespaces about a year ago, and we're still not PSR 4 compliant, and as a result, we're writing our own autoloaders every time that we want to add code to that big repository that we have, and it's a big pain. But people are finally waking up to the idea that some of these problems have already been solved. And so we should start following some of these community standards. And so we're taking baby steps, but getting better all the time. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, I think one of the big reasons why we have been successful in the past and we're continuing to be even more successful in the future is because we have such happy employees. Job satisfaction is incredibly high. Turnover is actually incredibly low. And I think a big reason for that is our developers feel like they're empowered to help make product decisions. They're not just given a list of requirements and then sent to go like code them in a corner. We're actually part of the discussion throughout the entire process. And another big thing is that the management philosophy at NPR is hire smart people and then get out of their way to let them do their job, because they're smart and you can trust them to do that. And another key is, of course, we can hire good coders, and we have. And like I said, I think the people here are some of the smartest people that I've ever met. But that's for us. I feel like it's not enough to just hire good coders. We really want to make sure that we hire good humans. And a big thing for this is making sure that these are people who are passionate about the products that they're building. They're not just coming to work every day to collect a paycheck. And they're open to new ideas and changing all the time. And I think that's about what we have for you. This is our contact information if you want to get in touch. You might want to take a picture of the slide because we're not going to dwell on this for very long. But again, we have a developer blog at npr.codes, which I would highly encourage you to check out and let us know what you think. And we do also have an NPR Tech Team Twitter account as well.
Yeah, we'll get the slides online too.
Yeah.
On was it Lanyard?
Right.
Yeah.
So, and with that, a big thank you to the PHP World sponsors and for Eli for inviting us to be here today.
All right. Thank you both very much. A couple quick announcements. The next session starts at 10 a.m. I want to highly encourage everyone to go check out Open Spaces. The 10 a.m. session Open Spaces